let's be real here, lads. 2020 was a bad year for all of us, for so many reasons. But at least most of us made it through without losing any of our limbs, which is more than can be said for the poor soul today's episode is about. I realise this opening is kind of blasé, but I probably should include the warning that this episode is going to cover some pretty awful stuff that was done to an animal, so if that's not something that you're up to hearing about right now, then please feel free to tap out. I'm not going to get super graphic or gratuitous, but I can't tell this story without mentioning it at all, and ultimately this story does have a positive ending. But anyway, back to 2020. In the late afternoon of the 6th of July, in the Brazilian city of Confins, a 2-year-old white pit bull named Sansão decided to go on a little adventure, leaping the wall from his owner's garden into the next-door neighbour's. It was then that he encountered the neighbour's dog, who didn't take kindly to this intruder, and the two dogs got into a fight. Now, anyone who's been in a situation where your dog is being attacked by someone else's knows how terrifying it can be, and a lot of us wouldn't hesitate to step in to protect our fur baby from harm, even if that means risking getting bitten ourselves. Some people might even resort to physically hitting the aggressor, not with the intention of hurting it, but just trying to get them to leave your dog alone. I don't think anyone would have blamed the neighbours for doing something like that to try and break up the fight between Sansão and their dog, but unfortunately they chose a much more extreme path. I don't know the exact timeline of events. I don't know if the neighbours' attack on Sansão was part of them trying to stop the dogs from fighting, or something that they did afterwards, as some sources referred to it as an act of revenge. But regardless, they armed themselves with a sickle, an agricultural tool similar to a machete or scythe, and attacked Sansão, cutting off both of his back legs. Sansão's owner, Gleidson Justino da Silva, also alleges that in order to protect themselves while they were doing it, they used a piece of barbed wire as a muzzle to keep Samson from biting them, which, if true, would definitely support the revenge theory rather than it being a heat-of-the-moment thing while the dogs were actively attacking each other. But even if that wasn't the case, it was a completely disproportionate response, and so unnecessarily violent. I don't know how Sansão got home. I don't know if the attackers dumped him, if his owner realised something was going on and went to get him, or if he managed to drag himself back, but either way, Da Silva was obviously absolutely horrified at the state of his beloved pet, who was bleeding out and on death's door. He'd lost so much blood that he'd entered a state of hypovolemic shock. He was in such a bad way that he couldn't make the journey to get vet care. Instead, a vet had to come to him and get him stabilised before he could be moved to a proper clinic. Once there, he immediately went into the surgery to address the harm done to his hind legs. Of course, there was nothing that could be done to reverse the damage, and they found that the injuries were so severe that they ended up having to amputate additional parts of the legs. It was touch and go as to whether or not Sansão would even survive, and he needed multiple blood transfusions, but ultimately he did pull through the initial treatments. But as I'm sure you can imagine, that was only the beginning of Sansão's journey. Recovering from such a severe attack would take a long time, and it would take longer still for him to adapt to having lost both of his hind legs. But he was alive, and that was a testament to the skill and dedication of the vets who treated him, with news coverage singling out one named Julia Mara Santiago as being particularly involved in saving Sansão's life. Sansão's name is the Portuguese version of Samson, and true to his namesake, Sansão proved to be strong. Within 24 hours of the attack, Sansão was moved from the vets where he'd had his initial treatment to a teaching clinic at Arnaldo College in Belo Horizonte, where he could receive the ongoing orthopaedic and physiotherapy treatments he'd need under the eye of vet Ticiana Lima Dormas. Only 2 days after the attack, Julia Mara Santiago told reporters that Sansão was doing well and back to eating normally. Despite their negative reputation, pit bulls are known to have wonderful personalities, playful and loving, the kind of dogs who never let anything get them down for long, always ready with a smile and a wagging tail, and Sansão was no exception to that. His family described him as being quiet, calm and tame, and from the photos they shared, it's clear that he was a very happy, very loved dog. Even after going through such horrific things at the hands of humans, he remained happy and trusting of people. And Sansão went on to not only survive his attack, but thrive. A doggy wheelchair was quickly donated by a charity, which he adapted to well, but he also learnt to move around without it. being filmed running around on just his 2 front legs less than a month after he was attacked. When the attack first happened, it had been featured in the local news. Tens of thousands of people were eagerly keeping up to date with his recovery through social media, and there were plenty of NGOs offering their support. And the story of Sansao's recovery was certainly heartwarming, especially the fact that he retained his classic pitbull joy throughout. But even more than the love they felt for Sansao, the people of Brazil were furious. How could anyone commit such a horrific act of violence against an innocent dog? And more importantly, what were the authorities doing to bring his attackers to justice? There were 2 men that were responsible for the mutilation of Sansao. One of them quickly fled, and I couldn't find any mention of him after that. From what I can tell, he was successful in escaping justice. But his accomplice was not so lucky. He was arrested and questioned, but then released while the investigation was underway, which was the standard practice at the time, as although animal abuse was illegal, it wasn't considered a serious offence. And so even for those who were found guilty, the penalty would be minimal, usually just a relatively small fine. During the police investigation into the suspect, it was found that Sansao was far from the only animal he was hurting. Inside his home, at least 13 other animals were found, all of whom were being mistreated in some way or another. They were left without proper care, food, water, or shelter. One of the animals, a chicken, passed away because it had been so severely neglected. The surviving animals were all removed from his care, and I use the word care very loosely there. Ultimately, Sansao's attacker would be found guilty of animal abuse, and was handed 15 different fines as a punishment, only one of which was for what he did for Sansao. The rest of them were related to the other animals found in his home. The fines totalled up to just under 19,000 reais, which sounds like a lot, but it only converts to about £2,500 or $3,500, if not a bit less. People were furious, and rightly so. How could someone commit such a brutal attack on an innocent dog, neglecting over a dozen other animals so severely that at least one of them passed away, and receive little more than a slap on the wrist? But there wasn't much more that could be done under the current laws. Brazil's animal abuse statute hadn't been updated for over 20 years, and our understanding of an animal's ability to suffer and the potential link between violence against animals and violence against humans have both come a long way in that time. The laws needed to change, and animal lovers across Brazil were determined to come together to make that happen. Protests and public demonstrations were held to demand justice for Sansao and put pressure on the government to change the laws around animal protection. The problem is that at this time, the president of Brazil was Jair Bolsonaro, a violently right-wing man who's best remembered for destroying the Amazon rainforest and removing protections for indigenous communities, among just a laundry list of other awful things. And given Bolsonaro's everything, it's not surprising that he was initially hesitant to enact change. One of the justifications he used for digging in his heels was pointing out that the sentencing guidelines for animal abusers were exactly the same as those for people who abandoned children or adults without capacity. He argued that it was ridiculous to have stricter punishments for cruelty to animals than cruelty to humans. Which is a kind of a weak excuse. Like, all our laws protecting the vulnerable are too lenient, which means we can't change any of them. Somehow, people were not convinced by this shining example of logic, and continued protesting, pointing out as they did so that if the sentencing for other forms of cruelty and mistreatment were too lenient, then that just meant that they should also be changed. The public outcry was so intense and so sustained that ultimately Bolsonaro had no choice but to give in. He was clearly still under some duress though, and decided to publish the full text of the proposed law onto Facebook to get people's opinions on it. It was just bizarre. I've never heard of a world leader doing that kind of thing before, and I honestly don't know what he was trying to achieve. The only thing I can think is that he was hoping there'd be enough comments opposing it to justify him rejecting the bill. I don't know if this was something he did regularly throughout his presidency and this was just the only time I've ever heard of it, or if this was a one-off, but either way it just feels really unprofessional. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm all for politicians listening to the people and acting in the public's best interests, but I don't know, the whole Facebook thing is just strange. But regardless, the public's response was pretty much unanimous. They wanted the laws to be changed so that animals had better protection, and by now Bolsonaro had run out of excuses. On the 29th of September 2021, the new law was formally signed at a ceremony held at the presidential palace. As well as the usual political types, it was also attended by some of the activists who'd fought for the change, as well as several dogs. Sansão, who by now had fully recovered, was the guest of honour, and Bolsonaro's own 2 pet dogs were also in attendance. In the true style of a politician, Bolsonaro acted as if he'd always supported the laws because he was just such a caring and just ruler who wanted what was best for Brazil, and definitely not the kind of guy who'd commit multiple atrocities against his own citizens and the environment. He even decided to be all fun and quirky by letting his own dogs sign the law after him, picking them up and putting one of their paws on it to leave a print. And he directly addressed Sansão, speaking to him in his own language. Ow! Ow! Apparently it translates to, "Congratulations, Sansão." Was it all just reputation laundering? Of course. But it was still a major win for the animal welfare movement. Now, anyone found guilty of the abuse, mistreatment, or mutilation of a dog or cat will face a prison sentence of between 2 and 5 years, in addition to having to pay a fine and losing custody of their animals. The severity of such crimes was also increased, which would allow for more of a police response to alleged cases, and it also meant that anyone who was convicted would be left with a criminal record, something which wasn't the case before. The law only offers increased protections for dogs and cats though, no other animals. If you get caught doing the same thing to, say, a farmed animal or a companion of a different species, then that would still be a case regulated by the previous laws. But even so, it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully it will go on to save many more dogs and cats from suffering the same kind of attack as Sansão. I wanted to tell Sansão's story for several reasons. Firstly, it's an incredible tale of survival. The fact that Sansão not only recovered from his injuries but went on to thrive is amazing, and his ability to keep his friendly, loving disposition throughout it all even more so. But Sansão's story is also a perfect example of why activism is so important. How it can be effective even when you're living under systems and individuals who seem not to care. Raising awareness, putting pressure on those in power, and taking to the streets to protest can all make a tangible difference, even in situations that seem hopeless. And this doesn't just apply to animal welfare, of course. Climate change, social justice, any and every aspect of total liberation. If people had heard about what happened to Sansão and been horrified but not done anything about it, then nothing would have changed. But people took their heartbreak and outrage and empathy and turned it into a powerful force for good. And that's something that we all have the ability to do when we hear about injustice. If you run in the same kind of online circles as me, then in recent months you'll definitely have heard the quote, "The power of the people is greater than the people in power," and that's 100% true. I know fighting for a better world can be overwhelming and exhausting. I know it can feel hopeless at times, like a never-ending uphill battle that you can never win. But if we look at history, beyond just Sansão's case, it's clear that the only thing that creates positive change in the world is when enough people get together, united by a common cause, to demand that things change, and to do the work to make it happen. And we can see that same thing happening around us right now too. Every single day, people are taking action, and it is having an effect. I didn't intend for this episode to get so preachy or whatever, but I feel like we could all do with a reminder of our power sometimes, especially now. And I'm certainly no exception to that. But I'm gonna step down from my soapbox for now. Thank you for bearing with me. And thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. If you enjoyed it, then it would mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way that you can, whether that's by leaving us a review or rating in your podcast player, sharing the show with a friend, or liking the video and leaving a comment if you're listening via YouTube. Speaking of making positive change in the world, any and all money made through this podcast goes directly to an animal sanctuary called the Little Rescue Zoo. So you're helping to make the world a better place for animals in need just by listening to and supporting the show, which is cool. All of the sources used in this episode can be found in the show notes, and before I close out, I should probably include the disclaimer that most of the coverage of this story, especially the primary sources, are all in Brazilian Portuguese, for obvious reasons, and that is a language that I very much do not speak, so I've had to rely heavily on Google Translate for researching this episode. Because of that, there could be tiny inconsistencies or miswordings of things, but I did my best to try and make sure that all of my information was as accurate as I could get it, but please do forgive me if there are any issues. There really wasn't much English coverage of this story at all. And likewise, although I've done my best to research the pronunciations of names and places in this episode, I'm not familiar with Brazilian Portuguese, or any kind of Portuguese for that matter, so I'm also sorry if I messed up on any of the pronunciations of them. Again, I'm doing my best, but very much not perfect here. But yeah, thank you again so much for listening, I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!